Today for the annual Heidegger Memorial Lecture. And today we have from Rice University, Chair of the Philosophy Department and Professor of German Studies, Professor Stephen Crowell. His work mainly in 20th century continental philosophy, phenomenology, and sort of what comes out of phenomenology in the 20th century. His publications include the book Husserl, Heidegger, and the Space of Meaning, which came out with Northwestern University Press, and he's also the author of numerous articles on figures such as Nietzsche, Husserl, Heidegger, articles on phenomenology, and on neo-Kantianism, which is something that nobody writes on, but should. One of the reasons that we brought Professor Crowell is that one of the things that Heidegger was always interested in was people who do work both in the continental tradition as well as other traditions. And the sort of work that Professor Crowell does, one of the things that's distinctive about it, I think, is that it's the kind of stuff that can really bring the phenomenological and continental tradition to people from other traditions, such as the infamous analytic tradition. So I would just like to bring Professor Crowell up to give his paper, Heidegger on Conscience and Reason, in fundamental.
Title change. Okay. Thank you very much. I'm delighted to be here and delighted to be speaking in this memorial lecture series for Heidegger. I did not know her personally, but did know of her and her work, and she was always spoken of very highly, and it was a terrible loss to all of us when she died. My good friend Gail Weiss did edit a collection with Heidi and heard many good things. And I thank the philosophy department for bringing me. It's a real pleasure to be in Denver, a place that I grew to love in high school, but didn't get back very much since then, a long time ago. There are two handouts for the paper. Does everybody have two handouts? I'll explain them, or they will be explained, as the paper goes on. One is a passage that I'm going to be commenting on extensively, and it's probably, I think, the most obscure passage in Being and Time. Naturally, I think I have an angle on it, but I guess you'll be the judge of that. Since the translation is difficult, I'm giving you the German as well. The second is a kind of map of the care structure. I give this is in Being and Time, I give you this because I'll be making reference to these rubrics and concepts as I go through, and I want you to be able to visualize and see it, because this isn't sort of everyday talk. I hope that it will be self-explanatory, but basically down the left-hand side are three structures that Heidegger uses to account for what the tradition would call self-consciousness. And then if you read from left to right, the two other the columns constitute the two modalities in which this whole structure can be found: the everyday mode and the mode of breakdown, which then leads into the issue of authenticity, which is sort of there at the bottom, as a kind of funnel from breakdown into authenticity, something like that. Okay, but I won't go into that anymore right now. Now, the paper, I'm going to try to talk a little bit, part of it through, and read some of it, and I hope it will be clear enough as I go. The paper is part of a larger project, and so I'm cutting out parts of it that don't pertain necessarily to what we're doing here today. I start the paper by talking about Kant, and what I really want to do in the paper is talk about the ground or foundation of intentionality. And intentionality I'm understanding as follows. Namely, it's that whereby we encounter meaningful entities. That which makes it possible for something to be encountered as something. So I don't just find myself in a room full of stuff. I encounter pens and papers. And I encounter something as a pen or as a chair. It's that whole as dimension. That's what, or meaning, how are things meaningful for us? Now, as far as, intentionality is a big problem, and I'm not going to talk about all the things that are problematic about it, but what I argue at the beginning of the paper is that Kant's critique of pure reason is, the project there is to show how reason makes intentionality possible. This isn't going to be a talk about Kant. I just want you to say, that's my stand on it. That's how I understand what he's doing there. And I explain that in the paper, but it's not essential that we know what that means. Because what I really want to do is say that that's what Heidegger's doing too. I want to argue that what Heidegger's doing is showing how reason makes intentionality possible. Now, most people who know Heidegger will think that this sounds absurd and ludicrous. And in some sense, I agree. But because isn't it the case that Heidegger argues that it's not reason, but what he calls the understanding of being that makes intentionality possible? It's not something like an I think, but Dasein as care. So there's the first reference to care, the care structure that I map out here. Heidegger, isn't that what the project of being and time is about? To show how understanding of being makes intentionality possible, or how care is prior to reason. Yes, it is. That's what it is. But I want to argue that we can have a better understanding of how reason functions to make intentionality possible if we start with Heidegger's ontology of care rather than starting with the traditional ontology of self-consciousness. That's the modern account of reason in terms of self-consciousness. So on the chart, I say here, over here, these structures are what Heidegger substitutes for the traditional account of self-consciousness. And this will provide a better account of how reason functions to make intentionality possible. But there's a further objection, an obvious objection to Heidegger that Heidegger people will raise, namely that the care structure itself, you look on the care structure here, there's nothing that says anything about reason on there. It seems to exclude reason altogether. And indeed, Heidegger himself says that reason is the most stiff-necked adversary of thought. So he seems like he doesn't want to have anything to do with reason, marginalizing it, throwing out. So that would seem like this is an objection to what I'm trying to do. And indeed, this is a general criticism of Heidegger, that, for instance, his ontology has no room for the normative. It can't account for genuine normativity, of which reason is only one example. So, what is it? I'm going to start here with the main part of the paper by running through this objection as it shows up in its classic formulation in Ernst Tugendhat's book, Der Wahrheitsbegriff bei Husserl und Heidegger, the concept of truth in Husserl and Heidegger. Here Tugendhat claims that in Heidegger's attempt to ground propositional truth in the more primordial truth of Dasein's disclosedness, the specific sense of truth is lost. The predicate true properly applies to propositions because they can be assessed in terms of a distinction between correct and incorrect, measured against the entity as it is in itself. Heidegger argues that for an entity to serve as such a measure, it must show up in a holistic context of significance, which he calls world, that has been disclosed in advance, that discloses as he terms ontological truth. Such truth does not stand in normative relation to falsity, but to closed offness. However, Tugendhat argues that because Heidegger provides no explanation of what governs this distinction, in the way that appeal to the entity as it is in itself governs the distinction between correctness and incorrectness, it is a pseudo-normative distinction. Rather than being something accessible in terms of success or failure, disclosedness or ontological truth is something that merely occurs or happens. As a condition for any encounter with entities, disclosedness provides a conditio sine qua non, but the specific sense of the truth relation, its distinctive normativity, according to Tugendhat, is not clarified. Now, Heidegger thinks he answers this charge in Division 2, the second part of Being in Time, with his account of authenticity and conscience, but Tugendhat thinks he fails in this attempt. And several other people share Tugendhat's view. So I want to look at a few of these to show these other criticisms to show what's at stake in the debate. So I'll first look at Robert Pippin's criticisms of Heidegger's position. Let's begin by considering what any explanation of intentionality must provide. Intentionality is philosophically perplexing because by means of it, we are not simply in causal interaction with entities, but have to do with them as something. One way to get at this distinction is to say that to be involved with something as something is to be governed by the conditions that the thing must satisfy in order to be what it is taken to be. This means that intentionality is a normative notion governed by conditions of success or failure. For instance, for me to experience something as a pen, for that to be the intentional content of my state, I must be responsive to the rules which constitute something as a pen. Stating what these rules are can be difficult. Indeed, whether they can be stated at all is a matter of some dispute. But unless it's true that in the face of a thing's failure to live up to some of its satisfaction conditions, I would admit that my experience had not been of a pen, then I could not have been involved with it as a pen at all. That's a little convoluted, but I hope the idea came through. Now, Heidegger appears to have an account of this kind of normativity. In keeping with his rejection of a Cartesian subject whose mental states determine the content of its experience, Heidegger locates the norms governing intentionality not in the individual subject's representations, but in social practices. Before being an individual subject, Dasein is a socialized one, or das Man, so that's up here in the everyday mode, the one, out in the everyday mode. Before being an individual subject, Dasein is a socialized one, das Man, the they, constituted by what is average, the normal, and thereby caught up in what is normative. It is because I conform to the way one does things that entities can become available to me as appropriate, and so as pens, shoes, eating utensils, and so on. Such normativity simply arises in the course of these practices. It is not the result, it's not the result of, and hence it's not explicable in terms of, reason. It just arises from the practices. Intentionality does not rest upon a transcendental logic, but upon the de facto normativity of practices. Robert Pippin, however, has questioned the adequacy of this account, arguing that it explains only how we act in accord with norms, when what we really need to explain is how we can act in light of norms. By emphasizing mindless conformism over any quasi-intentional features of taking up or sustaining a practice, Heidegger's interpretation conceals a moment of self-conscious agency that has not been given its due, says Pippin. I'm just talking about his criticism now. Even to say that I'm conforming to a norm is to say more than that it just happens. When Heidegger suggests that in practices I let things be involved, this implies more than simply using things appropriately. It implies that I use them in light of such appropriateness. Social practices are such that one can be doing them only if one takes oneself to be doing them. The Kantian rationalist will explain the distinction between acting merely in accord with norms, or conformism, and acting in light of them by appeal to self-legislation or pure practical reason. And Pippin acknowledges that Heidegger's rejection of this kind of rationalism has some plausibility. Well, we do, of course, inherit and pass on much unreflectively, or at least in a way that makes the language of self-imposition and justification look highly idealized, he says. Nevertheless, he requires that Heidegger provide some account of, quote, the internal structure of sustaining and reflecting social practices, without which we cannot distinguish acting in accord with norms from acting in light of them. Because Heidegger does not provide such an account, his appeal to sociality is ultimately operatic failure. Pippin recognizes that such an account should be given in Division 2 of Being and Time, but he believes that, quote, the themes of anxiety, guilt, and the call of conscience, authenticity, and resoluteness do not shed much light on the problem. Because they represent a total breakdown, so here's the breakdown part, because they represent a total breakdown of the seamless conformity to norms grounded in das Man, the one, they provide merely an indeterminate negation of the conformist self, one that reveals no positive resources for a normatively oriented sustaining and reflecting of inherited norms. Pippin is the Hegelian, by the way. This language is Hegel's. In short, Heidegger lacks an adequate concept of self-consciousness in Hegel's sense, an account of deliberation oriented toward reasons. But is it true that Division 2 of Being and Time sheds no light on this problem? Can the existential analyses of anxiety, conscience, and resoluteness really be relegated to the scrap heap of indeterminate negation? Pippin challenges us to look again at these chapters to see whether they might yield something like a notion of normative self-consciousness, something that would illuminate what it means to act in light of norms or to act on reasons, without implying, as Pippin following Hegel does, that authentic disclosiveness must be a consequence of deliberation. Perhaps critics have been putting the wrong questions in these chapters, one that conceals the place that reason already occupies there. So I'll turn to this third section, to Ernst Tugendhat's criticism. It is in fact possible to identify precisely where the wrong question gets asked if we turn to Tugendhat. Elaborating the critical insight underlying his book on truth, Tugendhat has recently argued that, quote, the moral and indeed the normative as such in general does not appear in Being and Time. Of course, das Man involves a kind of normativity, but this is entirely conventional, and so Tugendhat argues it is compatible with Dasein's being hardwired for it. True normativity is distinguished from conventionality precisely in that it involves a claim to grounding, and so includes what Tugendhat calls a specific depth dimension of deliberation and reason-giving. Corresponding to this is the existential condition of Eigenständigkeit, or kind of autonomy, standing on one's own 2 feet, a kind of freedom constituted by a concern for this depth dimension of reasons. Just this, Tugendhat argues, is absent from Being in Time. Quote, it emerges that of the 3 crucial concepts that were mentioned, deliberation, reasons, norms, not a single one is found in Being in Time. They neither occur there, nor is there anything remotely resembling them. The individuality and freedom required for deliberation do appear in connection with authenticity, but precisely there, no trace of deliberation and reasoning is to be found. Indeed, as Tugendhat says, resoluteness excludes deliberation. Hence, Being in Time provides no account of the depth dimension of reasons. But just where should we expect reason and deliberation to show up in an account of resoluteness? Resoluteness here is down here by authenticity is part of that. Where should we expect reason and deliberation to show up in this account? Deliberation concerns the reasons for what I do, considers which possibilities are better grounded. Tugendhat distinguishes between 2 levels at which the call for deliberation might arise. At the first level, that of moral and prudential deliberation, I consider the relative weight that a given desire should have in the order of my willing. Though I deliberate as an individual, my appeal to reason here ensures that my answer will remain general, an expression of how one should live. At the second level, however, that of authenticity, as Tugendhat interprets it, it is my set of desires as a whole that's at stake, and I'm faced with the question of how I should live. In the face of death, I ponder whether I have really lived my life or whether life has passed me by. Heidegger's account of resoluteness is said to address this issue. In what sense, then, does it exclude deliberation? First, There's the trivial sense in which Heidegger's text offers no account of prudential and moral deliberation. But since Tugendhat correctly sees that authenticity is not equivalent to the question of what is morally right, one cannot infer that being in times ontology excludes such an account. Instead, Tugendhat argues that the question to which resolute choice is the answer excludes deliberation. That question excludes deliberation. Noting that the question of what my life means, or who I should be, is not the sort of thing on which deliberation can get a grip. The very singularity of the question seems to exclude the publicity and universality of reason giving. Because there is no depth dimension of reasons to appeal to here, Tugendhat suggests that, quote, ultimate enlightenment lies in realizing the senselessness of the question. Who am I? Who shall be senseless? Nothing to appeal to. Okay. He therefore heaps scorn on what he takes to be Heidegger's appeal to guilt and conscience as ersatz norms that would substitute for the impossibility of deliberation. But what if these notions are not intended to supply non-rational standards for a choice where reason can no longer be in play? That is, in relation to the ontic question of who I should be. What if it doesn't concern that? What if they serve the ontological function of clarifying how any answer to that ontic question brings with it an orientation toward reasons, thus making deliberation itself possible? In that case, Heidegger's identification of resoluteness with existential truth would not, as Tugendhat believes, amount to, quote, an attempt to banish reason from human existence, particularly from the relation of oneself to oneself, but would rather be the account of why reason belongs to that relation. How do I come to be oriented toward truth and justification? How do I enter into the depth dimension of reasons? Just this, and not the question of how I should live my life, is at stake in Heidegger's ontological discussion of conscience. Tugendhat argues that one who deliberates morally seeks those reasons for acting that are reasons for everyone. That is, to do that which everyone would be justified in doing. This means that the deliberator is one for whom this, quote, universal justifiability has become a motive. But as Tugendhat notes, how such a thing can become a motive is not self-evident. Before the ontologist delves into the practice of moral deliberation, then, he or she might well wish to understand how the actor comes to be concerned with reasons at all. If Tugendhat is right that Heidegger has little to say about the first question, he misses the fact that Heidegger has much to say about the second. The chapter on conscience does not supply ersatz criteria for an otherwise irrational choice, but articulates our capacity for entering into the space of reasons. Section 4, locating reason in time and sight, being in time. Can such an assertion that I just made, namely that the chapter on conscience articulates our capacity for entering into the space of reasons, can such an assertion, which certainly does not sound very Heideggerian, be at all supported by the text of being in time? It can, but the evidence will be regarded a good deal of unpacking. Here I refer you to the passage, which I hand out because that is my evidence primarily, and I'll be commenting on it in various ways. In explicating his formalized concept of guilt, which I'll get to later, this is what is happening in this passage that I pass out here. In explicating his formalized concept of guilt, Heidegger writes, quote, the self, which as such has to lay the ground for itself, can never get that ground into its power. And yet it has to take over being the ground existingly. In case this is not crystal clear, Heidegger goes on to explain Dasein is not through itself, but is released to itself from the ground in order to be as this ground. Dasein is not itself the ground of its being insofar as this ground first springs from its own projection. But as being a self, it is indeed the being of the ground. This ground is always only ground of an entity whose being has to take over being a ground. Heidegger 101. You know, this is it. I will hopefully try to make this passage clear subsequently. The burden of my argument is to show that taking over being a ground must be understood as including a reference to ground as reason. Grund is the German term for reason. People resist using that translation for it in any context in Heidegger except the negative one, but I will insist in my argument that this passage can't be understood without taking that valence of that term into account. So then, what then is to be understood by reason? The link between the idea of conscience as taking over being a ground and the concept of ground as reason is to be found in the character of conscience as a call, that is, in its character as discourse. All of this is coming, of course, from reading across the chart. For reason has a double connection to discourse. First, reasoning is a discursive practice in which something is offered or given. Support for one's judgment, justification for one's behavior. Second, that which is given, the reason, is itself something that, in Scanlon's phrase, speaks for something else. Not in the sense of speaking in place of something else, but in the sense of telling in favor of it, or telling for it. Corresponding to this double connection is a double normativity. First, as a practice, reason giving, like all practices, depends on logical and pragmatic constitutive rules that determine what counts as success or failure. Second, what is given in this practice itself stands in a normative relation to something, namely that for which it supplies the reason, that for which it speaks. The attempt to link conscience to reason by means of its character as a call, that is, as a mode of discourse, may seem unpromising if we recall certain passages about discourse in Being and Time. Everywhere, Heidegger seems keen to dissociate language from reason, to liberate grammar from logic, as he puts it. Heidegger argues that the logical forms of language, apophansis, predicative assertion, judgment, are parasitical on a more primordial sense of logos, as letting be seen. However, the thesis being advanced here, that is my thesis, is not that the call of conscience is itself a mode of discourse that speaks for something else, a practice of reason-giving that employs predicative assertion. The claim is rather that the discourse of conscience is the ontological condition that explains the double normativity of that practice. The rule of accountability inherent in the practice of giving, and the rule of legitimation that underlies speaking for something. To flesh out this claim, and so to read our initial passage with more insight, we must locate conscience within the structure of Dasein's being as a whole, namely care. So now I'm going to comment on this chart. Discourse, so section 5, discourse and the structure of care. Discourse, Rede, is one of the three existential structures that go to make up Dasein's disclosiveness. That is, that account ontologically for the fact that I am in a world, a context of significance within which things can be encountered in all the ways that they are so encountered. The other two structures are disposition, Befindlichkeit, and understanding, Verstehen, so reading on the left of the column, left of the chart. Together, the three make up a framework of Heidegger's account of intentionality. The broad outlines of Heidegger's position are well known, so I will only mention them. First, disposition is that aspect of my being thanks to which things matter to me. I do not inhabit a world in which things are merely arranged around me in neutral fashion. Rather, they have a peculiar salience. They are alluring or repelling or irritating. This is because I am present to myself, not first of all through a theoretical reflection, but always through the feeling of my own having to be. I can be disposed in various ways, but I'm never without some mood. That's why things can matter. Second, understanding is not a mental operation, but a Sein können, as he says, an ability to be, a skill, a know-how, which Heidegger terms the projection of possibilities for being. It is because I possess such skills and abilities that I can encounter things in their possibilities. That is, that things can prove useful or appropriate for the tasks in which I'm engaged. Understanding in this sense yields a teleologically structured relevance totality, Bewandtnisganzheit. Things are there in order to accomplish some specific end, which in turn appears as something in order to accomplish some further end, and so on. And this totality is anchored in something like an end in itself, referred back to the being who acts for the sake of what it is, its practical identity. So the idea here is roughly, very roughly, I'm a student, that's my practical identity, it's a kind of skill or ability that I have, and that means that things are arrayed around me in terms of tasks that I need to do. I'm writing this paper, so I pick up the pen in order to write the paper. And that very in order to allows the pen to show up as something, namely as writing implement. So it goes back down not only to a series of in order tos, but also to a certain skill in which I understand myself, Heidegger's sense of understanding. I have a certain ability, which he calls for the sake of. Think about it as our roles, but that's a little too formal. And it's this ability that anchors the whole system. Okay. Discourse, thirdly, is what Heidegger calls the articulation of intelligibility, namely the articulation of that intelligibility that has its roots in disposition and understanding. Though disposition and understanding are necessary conditions for intentionality, they are not sufficient. For things to be significant, they must not merely be useful for something, but also tellable. What I am doing must be able to be named. Only so is it possible that things can show up as what they are. And without this as, we do not have intentionality. Heidegger initially describes care in its everyday modality, the middle column, and argues that the self of the everyday being in the world is the one, thus mine. That is, what makes up the significance of the world into which I am geared is not some content that belongs to my consciousness in terms of which I represent the world. Rather, it belongs to the public, the always historically and culturally particular social practices of those among whom I find myself. I conduct myself as one does in the roles I adopt. And in telling myself and others what I'm up to, I speak as one does. Quote, the one itself articulates the referential context of significance. The conformism that this picture of everyday Dasein evokes correlates to another aspect of everydayness, namely that my way of gearing into the world is not a function of deliberation, but rather of a mindless coping in which my abilities take the lead. To say that everydayness is mindless is not, however, to say that it is opaque. On the contrary, it is precisely clear, gelichtet. A necessary condition for the possibility of encountering things as meaningful is the habitual conformity to public norms, to the normal and average, and to the name. Now, this everyday notion of selfhood, this anonymous or typified one, does not give us an ontologically adequate account of that self who can say I in a strong sense, who can reason autonomously in the sense of the tradition. In this section that I'm going to skip and just mention here, I consider whether an analysis of deliberation by itself points to the missing ontological features. Deliberation emerges when the smooth, mindless functioning breaks down and I have to deal with something in particular. Well, can that kind of thing give us an account of the self, the strong sense of self as I? My claim is that it does not. Deliberation is a practice, it's an everyday practice, and it takes place within the same context and bound to the same everyday typical self from which it emerges, from which the thing. I deliberate, in other words, always in terms of my practical identity. What we need, then, is a more radical account of individuation. And we can talk about the deliberation issue later if you want, but I want to get to this more radical account of individuation, which shows up in Division 2 of Being and Time. Here, Heidegger considers an extreme possibility, not the disturbance of everyday coping, like when the hammer breaks, but its complete breakdown, the complete breakdown of everyday coping, in which the self is explicitly called into question as a self. Here, deliberation is impossible because the everyday world on which it depends, as Heidegger puts it, has the character of completely lacking significance. only in light of this liminal mode of being is the sufficient condition of intentionality, the possibility of a genuinely first-person stance, made evident. As I shall argue, the account of conscience that finds its place here articulates what it means to say I, such that I, and not only someone, have and can have reasons about which I'm liberated. It explains how one's reasons can be my reasons. Okay. For Heidegger, conscience is not itself a kind of private reason, but an ontological condition for distinguishing between external and internal reasons, between quasi-mechanical conformism and a commitment responsive to the normativity of norms. The liminal condition of breakdown is a modification of the care structure. So this is on the right-hand side of the chart. A modification of the care structure and thus involves the three elements of disposition, understanding, and discourse. As the sort of discourse that belongs to this modification, conscience will articulate the intelligibility of the self as disclosed through the other two elements, the disposition of angst and its corresponding mode of understanding, death. For our purposes, what matters most about these controversial analyses is that the way everyday familiarity collapses, so that Dasein is brought face to face with itself as being in the world. Anxiety is a distinctive disposition, so I'll just talk about these briefly. Anxiety is a distinctive disposition because it neutralizes the claims that things normally exert upon me, neutralizes them, and so also neutralizes the reasons they provide for what I do. Anxiety, quote, tells us that entities are not relevant at all, end quote. This does not mean that significance and reasons disappear. I still register their demands, but they no longer grip me. As Heidegger puts it elsewhere, anxiety reveals the strangeness of the fact that they are beings and not nothing. Beings are simply there, inert. This is because, second, anxiety does not, quote, concern a definite kind of being for Dasein or a definite possibility for it, but rather discloses Dasein as being possible as such. Things become insignificant. Reasons lose their grip just because I'm no longer drawn into the world in terms of some definite possibility, some definite practical identity. We ourselves, he says, slip away from ourselves. And with that go the constitutive rules that, belonging to our roles and practices, provide the terms in which I understand how to go on. Without these, I can neither act nor deliberate, strictly speaking. Conceived as a mode of understanding, ability to be, this being individuated down to my sheer being possible is, as William Blattner has shown, an inability to be. That is, death, as the possibility, as Heidegger calls it, the possibility of no longer being able to be there. Death, in Heidegger's sense, is not a matter of bodily demise, but an existential condition in which I am no longer able to gear into the world in terms of roles and practices, with the result that things have properties but no affordances, and the motives and reasons that the latter once supplied now take on the character of something closer to simple facts, items in the world of which I can take note, but which do not move me. The question that arises here is not how they could ever have been valid for me. As the one self, I'm simply defined by such validity, but how they could be valid for me now. That is, for the one who genuinely says, I. How can any reasons be my reasons? This question, I claim, is answered by the mode of discourse that articulates the intelligibility of breakdown, namely the call of conscience. What is given to understand in the call? Heidegger asks. He answers, guilty, schuldig. But such guilt cannot be explained with reference to any law, whether conventional, rational, moral, or divine. Because conscience articulates a condition in which such laws have ceased to make any claim on me, and persist merely as facts, inert items that lack normative force, what I'm given to understand about myself in conscience cannot be explained through transgression of them. Heidegger expresses this by saying that the term guilt must be formalized so that, quote, all reference to law, ought, and social relations drop out. But can the notion of guilt make sense without any reference to law or ought? Certainly, to owe someone something is not enough merely to possess what he once possessed. Rather, a law or norm governing exchange must be in place. But Heidegger's formalization is meant to bring out a further ontological point, namely that my relation to such a law or norm must be of a certain character as well. If I'm incapable of placing myself under the law, as may occur through various mental or physical incapacities, then I cannot be said to owe something either. Angst, in Heidegger's sense, reveals something like a global incapacity, vis-a-vis the normativity of all laws and oughts. Existing norms present themselves as mere facts. They have no more normative force than does the Code of Hammurabi. It may be true that a valid law obligates me whether or not I recognize it, but the point of Heidegger's formalization is to highlight the way law and ought can come to have standing from the first-person point of view. Thus, the role the analysis of guilt is supposed to play is relatively clear, I think. To say that this guilty turns up as the predicate for the I am, as Heidegger says, means that it belongs to my radically individualized mode of being, independent of any grasp of myself in terms of some specific practical identity. Further, what conscience gives to understand thereby is, quote, the ontological condition for Dasein's ability to come to owe anything in effectively existed. Conscience thus explains how I can come to be obligated. Since there is no question about how one comes to be obligated, the oneself simply conforms to constituted rules, Heidegger's concern is to show how, given the fact that the oneself can break down, something like a responsiveness to norms as norms is even possible. If that is so, we have the context necessary for understanding our initial text passage, since Heidegger offers to unpack his formalized definition of guilt as he offers this text passage as unpacking of his formalized definition of guilt as being the ground of a nullity. That's his formalized definition of guilt. We don't need to worry about that, we just want the unpacking. That context, as John Hoagland correctly sees, is Heidegger's account of responsibility, for which reason Hoagland translates schuldig not as guilty, but as responsible, in the sense both of at fault culpable, and obliged, indebted, liable. Yet being the ground of the nullity signifies responsibility in a further sense not noted by Hoagland, that of being answerable, verantwortlich, as Heidegger says. To see how this discursive sense is already at stake in our passage is to understand how conscience provides an ontological condition for reason. To make the case, I will argue first that conscience accounts for how grounds become reasons in the sense of my reasons. That is, that conscience explains my ability to act not just in accord with, but in light of norms. And second, that the notion of resoluteness as the authentic response to the call of conscience entails the project of giving reasons to oneself and to the other. So section 6, being guilty and the space of reasons. As a predicate for the I am, being guilty as being the ground of a nullity is not the simple state of an occurrent entity, but a way of existing, a modification of the care structure. The complexity of Heidegger's attempt to explain such a being a ground arises from the fact that the notion of ground is itself twofold, thanks to the two equiprimordial aspects of Dasein being thrownness and projection. That's on the chart, disposition and understanding. Ground means two things because there are these two aspects of the Dasein being. Heidegger first introduces the notion of ground in terms of thrownness. Dasein, now we're unpacking the passage. Dasein has not laid that ground itself, and yet it reposes in the weight of it, which is made manifest to it as a burden in its mood. What does ground mean here? Formally, as Getman has observed, it is simply what is out of reach, unverfügbar, that which the transcendental subject must posit itself as being posited by. I don't create myself. I find myself, as it were, already grounded. Less formally, however, several attempts to specify such a ground have been made. Heidegger sometimes suggests that it be conceived as nature or cosmos, which leads perhaps to some form of theological conception. Gadamer suggests that this dimension of Dasein's ground is language and tradition, which is always der Sein als Bewusstsein, or being and consciousness. Dreyfus glosses the notion by appeals to background practices belonging to one's social and cultural milieu. We need not decide the merits of any of these suggestions, since our concern is with what it might mean to be grounded in any of these ways, and my claim is that such grounds, to the extent they remain out of reach, cannot be conceived as reasons. This is clear if the fact that ground is conceived as nature. For to say that I'm grounded in nature is to say that I find myself within a causal nexus over which I have no control. The forces of nature that cooperate in ensuring that I do what I do cannot be confused with the reasons why I do it. Nature in this sense lies outside the space of reasons because its constraint on me is not normatively accessible, simply is or is not. Something similar holds if the ground is conceived either as history, tradition, or social practices, so long as we insist with Heidegger that it functions as a factic ground precisely to the extent that it is out of reach. For though we can see that social practices, for instance, must be understood normatively, that is, that they involve reasons in the sense of in order to's and for the sake of's, and so are accessible in terms of success or failure, it is not from the point of view of one's everyday coping that we make this judgment. The agent functions within the nexus of such practices in much the way that she functions within the constraints of nature. She acts in accord with norms, but not in light of them. Hence, such behavior is largely predictable from a third-person point of view. This is the picture of the functioning of norms within social practices we get from Division 1, where it's being time, where it's difficult to distinguish human from animal teleological action. Though we might be willing to describe animal behavior as being based on reasons, such reasons would be external. There are reasons for what Larry Bird does on the basketball court, just as there are reasons for what the wasp does in building its nest, but neither of them does that for those reasons, in light of it. Now, Robert Pippin is surely right to object that this mindless coping strikes a false note as a picture of human meaningful activity. But this is not an objection to Heidegger, for we are never simply grounded by the sort of factic ground disclosed in mood. I'm moving to the second sort of ground. Instead, though Dasein, quote, can never get that ground into its power, it has to take over being the ground existingly. In the structure of my being as care, my facticity is ramified always by my existentiality. Again on the chart there. That is, my projection of possibilities for being a self. That's what existentiality means. What does ground mean when it's ramified by existentiality? The answer must be given at an appropriately formalized level. Recall that in Angst, the concern is not for a definite kind of being for Dasein, or a definite possibility for it, but rather being possible as such. Thus, taking over the ground existingly may be described formally as possibilizing the factic ground. What the call of conscience gives to understand is that that which I can never get into my power, that which grounds me beyond my reach, is nevertheless my possibility. This, I suggest, can only mean, what does that mean? It can only mean, I suggest, that factic grounds become subject to a choice for which I'm accountable. They are thereby taken up into the normative space of reasons. The argument for this remains largely implicit in being and time, that is to say, it's not there. However, in the 1929 essay of Wesen des Bundes, Heidegger provides a crucial clarification of how factic grounds enter the space of reasons when Dasein takes over being and ground. The essay follows being and time in arguing that the in order to relations informing Dasein's practical dealings with things are anchored in Dasein's self-awareness as that for the sake of which it is so engaged. This possibility for being, or ability to be, discloses a totality of significance, or world, in terms of which entities gain entry into the world, show themselves in their possibilities, and thereby come, as Heidegger says, to be more in being. This more consists in entities being held up to constitute standards deriving from the world. And the essay makes clear what being in time did not, namely that Dasein's first-person self-awareness that makes worldhood possible is normatively oriented. Heidegger here calls this orientation sovereignty. In 1929, Heidegger glosses the care structure, transcendence of beings toward their being, with the Platonic notion of an epikeina tes ousios, a beyond beings. This suggests, so he's commenting on this passage from the Republic, this suggests that transcendence is connected with the good, Plato's notion, the idea of the good. And so Heidegger asks, may we interpret the agathon as the transcendence of Dasein? According to Heidegger, Plato's agathon is, quote, that hexis, or sovereign power, that is sovereign with respect to the possibility, in the sense of enabling, of truth, understanding, and even being. Such sovereignty, however, also describes the willen, or the for the sake of resolute, individuated Dasein. Thus, quote, the essence of the agathon lies in Dasein's sovereignty over itself as Henneke, as the for the sake of, which he gets from Aristotle. It is the source of possibility as such. By thus equating authenticity with the ancient Henneke and its orientation toward the good, or what is best, Heidegger suggests that to possibilize factic grounds by taking over being a ground is to act in light of the normative distinction between better and worse. By grasping my situation in the normative light of what is best, the factic grounds into which I am thrown become reasons for which I am responsible. To take over being a ground, then, that is, to possibilize what grounds me, is to transform the claims of nature or society, what one simply does, into first-person terms, into my reasons for doing what I do. Conscience discloses that I'm a being for whom throne or factic grounds can never function simply as causes. Because Dasein has been in the passage has been released from the ground, not through itself, but to itself, so as to be as this ground, grounds take on the character of reasons for which I'm accountable. My natural impulses are not within my power, but it is I who make them normative for me. My gearing into the world must take place in terms of social practices whose rules are not within my power, and so function essentially as grounds in the sense of causes. However, it is I who transform such functional effectuation into reasons for being, namely by answering for them as possibilities. If conscience articulates the intelligibility of the first-person standard that emerges in the collapse of the one self, Heidegger's gloss of the call in terms of being guilty identifies the ontological condition whereby one's factic grounds become my normative reasons, and thus explains how Dasein can act not only in accord with norms, but in light of them. I have one more section, and I'll try to be brief. Being guilty and giving reasons. There is a further aspect to the project whereby Dasein enters into the space of reasons through the possibilizing of factic grounds. Heidegger terms such a project resoluteness, from Schlosenheim, defined as, quote, the self-projection upon one's own most being guilty. To hear the call of conscience correctly, he says, is tantamount to having an understanding of oneself in one's own most potentiality for being. That is, to be guilty, to take over being a ground. I say this with emphasis. With the help of Fovesius Grundis, we have understood resoluteness as sovereignty, as Dasein's awareness of itself as being possible, acting in light of what is best, the agathon. But what belongs to such existence? On the one hand, I cannot improve on the answer that John Hoagland has provided in terms of his notion of existential commitment. To be resolved is to take responsibility for the standards inherent in the practices in which I engage. Only so is it possible for there to be practices rather than mere occurrences. For instance, if something can be a rook only because there is a practice, chess, in which it counts as such a thing, the idea of counting itself depends on my commitment to the game, without which the standards that determine success or failure might have normative authority, but would lack normative force. This is not to say that lacking my commitment there could be no rooks. Institutions and practices are social, after all. But neither do these things exist apart apart from all first-person commitment. On the other hand, this notion of commitment does not tell the whole story, for it does not reflect the specifically discursive aspect that for Heidegger belongs to taking over being a ground. To be responsible is to be answerable, and to be answerable for something is to be accountable for it. That is, to be prepared to give an account of oneself. Adumbrated here is a necessary connection between resoluteness as the possibilizing effect of grounds into normal reasons and the practice of giving reasons. To say that something becomes a reason for me is to say that it speaks for something else, justifies it. And such a thing makes sense only within the constituted rules of the practice of giving reasons. Thus, whatever be the particular project on which I resolve, whatever it is to which I commit fontically, I always at the same time commit myself to accountability as giving an account. The practice of giving reasons has its origin in the call of conscience. It is the discourse of the authentic response to the call. However, this claim appears to run afoul of the fact that Heidegger defines authentic discourse as reticence, not giving reasons. Once again, on the received view, authentic Dasein does not try to justify itself by giving an account of what it's doing. Rather, it goes silently about the world historical business upon which it has resolved in its decisionistic way. If Heidegger meant for us to understand that resoluteness entails the practice of giving reasons, why didn't he say so? Well, he did say so. He just didn't say it would be in time. To establish a specific textual connection between authentic discourse and the project of reason giving, we must return to the essay from Basil's Grunus. Quote, to what extent does there lie in transcendence the intrinsic possibility of something like ground or reason in general? End quote. Though from Basil's Grunus does not discuss conscience explicitly, in answering this question, it does suggest how resoluteness entails the practice of giving reasons. Identifying transcendence with the notion of freedom that is ontologically more original than that drawn from the concept of causality, Heidegger notes that prior to all comportment, freedom is the condition for being gripped by the normative. Transcendence means that human beings, quote, can be obligated to themselves, i.e. be free selves. And this, in turn, makes possible, quote, makes possible something binding, indeed, obligation in general. Hence, freedom, what being in time called taking over being the ground, is the origin of ground. Freedom, he says, is freedom for ground. In unpacking what this latter claim means, Heidegger shows us where the project of reason giving arises. There are three ways that, as he puts it, in grounding, freedom gives and takes ground. And each of these ways corresponds to one aspect of the care structure. So again, I'm going to map down the chart. First, there is grounding as what he calls taking up a basis within beings. A kind of belonging to beings whereby Dasein is, quote, thoroughly attuned by them. This factic grounding corresponds to care as disposition. Second, there is grounding as establishing, or stiften, which is, quote, nothing other than the projection of the for the sake of, that is, Dasein's understanding. As we saw, understanding opens up the space of reasons through orientation toward the normative, the agathon, seeing in light of what is best. Neither form of grounding, disposition or understanding, stiften and bodennehmen, neither form of grounding is itself, quote, a comportment toward beings. But together they, quote, make intentionality possible transcendentally in such a way that they co-temporalize a third manner of grounding as the grounding of something, the Gründung. This is normally justification or reason giving. So it is this form of grounding, Heidegger insists, that, quote, makes possible the manifestation of beings in themselves, the possibility of ontic truth. Now, as we would expect, this third form of grounding belongs to discourse as the remaining moment of the care structure. Thanks to the, quote, excessive possibility that is given in the projection world, that is, the excess grounded in the for the sake of as agathon that constitutes world as a normative totality of significance and brings entities or in being by holding them to constitutive standards, quote, the why question springs forth in relation to those beings that press around us as we find ourselves, end quote. If in Being and Time, Heidegger defined conscience as reticence, the silencing of the everyday way things are talked about so that the call can be heard, he now makes plain that answering the call involves discourse as Begründung, answering for oneself and for things. In the face of the call for oneself, Heidegger confronts the question, Dasein confronts the question, why this way, as he puts it, why this way and not otherwise, and thereby becomes accountable. Quote. An answer to the why question is a reason. Quote, because such Begründung prevails transcendentally from the outset throughout all being manifested beings, ontic truth, all ontic discovery and disclosing must account for itself. To account, in this sense, is to give reasons. As Heidegger explains, quote, this is how he counts, this is what he thinks reason giving is, but quote, what occurs is the referral to a being that then makes itself known, for example, as cause, or as the motivational grounds, motive, for an already manifest nexus of beings. A referral that's demanded by the what being and the how being of the relevant beings. You can find reasoning in there. Okay. And only because there is such a demand can Dasein, quote, in its factical accounting and justifications, cast reasons aside, suppress any demands for them, pervert them, cover them over, end quote. Lest there be any doubt about the matter, Heidegger terms the transcendental answering, which makes this ontic reason-giving possible, legitimation, Rechtgebung. Conscience then calls one to take over being a ground, to answer for oneself, to legitimate by giving grounds, that is, reasons. Hence, Heidegger concludes his essay by bringing these two elements of conscience, namely hearing and answering, together in relation to the regrettably undeveloped but essential reference to the one to whom reasons are finally given, and without whom the whole thing makes no sense. Quote, and only being able to listen into the distance, that is, vernehmen as registering the call, I'll just read the passage. And only being able to listen into the distance awakens Dasein as a self to the answer of the other Dasein with whom it can surrender its einness, that is, to whom it must account for itself so as to attain an authentic self. Now, this is the end. Needless to say, all this calls for more scrutiny. Even if the textual evidence of a connection between conscience and reason is sufficiently persuasive, it would still be necessary to examine more closely the connection between understanding, for the sake of agathon, normativity, and conscience, both as hearing the call and giving reasons. And it would be necessary to show how these two moments of conscience remain decisive when, in his later writings, Heidegger inquires into the two aspects of reason, reason as vernehmen, hearing, taking to heart, heißen and nous, on the one hand, and reason as ratio redende, account giving, legitimation, and logos on the other. But it is already something to have shown that being and time retains an important place for reason, that conscience underlies both our responsiveness to reasons and our practice of giving them. Thank you for your patience.
We have time to take questions.
So we have some questions?
Yeah.
Discuss.
If I would like to just take a moment.
Take a breath. Yeah, we always have this thing where we take a couple minutes, walk around, stretch your legs. And
You want to take a few minutes maybe to get something to drink and then come back to the questions?
it's up to you, whatever your
Okay, just like a few minutes.
And that is whether or not the reason giving that we locate in conscience would actually be the sort that is neither public, whether necessarily public or necessarily universal. And it seems to me that we already think something like that in terms of conscience. We allow for a conscientious objector, and that is primary phenomenon of conscience, where
really is the normative force of that? What do we expect? I mean, we just don't allow just anybody, you know. I mean, there are, as it were, restrictions on what counts there. And I would say that in a certain way, there's going to be an element of publicity that's going to come back in there. Not just anything counts. But I think you're right that that what Heidegger has provided here doesn't limit us to giving reasons that are, as were acknowledged as universal. And that I haven't said anything. I mean, I think there's a big thing that I have to develop here and needs to be developed about the status of a potentially, universally valid kind of reason that could be established as universally valid. Because there's two things that you have to distinguish, I think. In giving reasons, you, as it were, assert that they're publicly available and that they are somehow compelling, right? They're out there and they're somehow compelling. Whether or not all such such publicly compelling reasons have then to rest upon some foundation that would be universally valid in a Kantian sense, I'm not sure. And I don't think there's anything in Heidegger's analysis that, as it were, compels the answer phenomenologically one way or the other. So all I would want us to get here, I mean, one part I left out of the paper was that in giving reasons, I don't actually have to initially appeal to the other, in offering reasons to the other. In a certain sense, I'm giving reasons to myself. And when you talk about conscientious objecting there, in a certain way, in giving these reasons to myself, they claim me. But it's funny because they have to justify me in some kind of way. And the idea that they justify me in some kind of way ought to be available to others as well. I mean, the fact that I'm just keeping silent and keeping to myself doesn't really have much to say about whether, I mean, in a sense, they should be made public, capable of being made public. But then I come up against, what was obviously, in a certain sense, Heidegger's model for this whole thing, which is Abraham and Fear and Trembling. And of course, he can't. I mean, you talk about, there's like he's a conscientious objector from the moral law, and he can't. What is compelling for him, this notion that I'm being commanded by God, as Kierkegaard points out quite clearly, can't be made public. It doesn't have any public basis. It's not part of a public practice, which is why he says the church as a public institution is ridiculous. There is no public church. So that does, to the extent that Heidegger goes in the Abrahamic direction on the question of conscience, that's an interesting phenomenological problem that I'm not quite sure where I want to go. Yeah.
I have guess to kind of clarify a little more about this combination of grounds being out of reach, but that you have to take them over, right? And just, I guess, what I'm wondering about is how that aspect of guilt. I mean, I think one of the things I like about the translating that as guilty rather than responsible is this that it carries that idea of impossibility with it, right? That you can't ever get out of the guilt, and all the stuff about falling, about how you never get out of the throw, that you're always falling back from taking over the ground. Mm-hmm. And in this first quote, where he talks about, where he mentions that you can never, never get the ground under its power. Mm-hmm. I guess just one thing that I think, at least for me, might clarify this a little is with regard to this idea of possibilizing factic grounds, which is kind of that combination. They're factic and therefore out of reach, but that the possibilizing something other than just sort of leave them out of your reach, right? That it's not just like laws of nature, which I guess you can't really possibilize laws of nature. There's nothing you can do about that. Or maybe you can say more about that. But I guess what I'm wondering then is how the aspect of guilt as carrying this impossibility with it plays into the idea of giving reasons. Is there something about giving reasons that always falls short?
Yeah, it's
Which by the
you can't be self-grounding in that sense, you know. So
Right.
I mean, in a way, taking over being a ground. When you start giving reasons, you're going to get into a kind of Freudian thing. I mean, is that the real reason? You know?
Right.
That's certainly there. But that's not exactly where I would go with in answering the first part of your question. So,
Well, then I guess what exactly possibilizing these factic grounds?
yeah.
How that's, I guess what I'm trying to see is what the difference is between simply the grounds being out of reach and what exactly happens with this moment of possibilization. What that does with regard to the out of reach character of the ground.
Okay.
Which seems that it seems like he wants to always leave that a kind of being out of reach there.
Yeah.
And then and so there's this all this stuff about there's always something still outstanding for Dazan and how that plays into the stuff on death.
Mm-hmm.
And so I guess what I'm trying to get a handle on is what exactly this possibilizing does then to do something about the out of reach character of the ground.
Yes, I would agree with your first point that you made about that something remains out of reach. And if you want to, the notion of guilt, he kind of plays on that. I mean, it's always, you know, I try to take over being the ground, but I never can, you know, and that somehow, you know, what that has to do with guilt in the ordinary sense is anybody's guess. But because he formalizes it, and you can make a case for it. But yes, that's precisely the point that he. There isn't any kind of transformation going on that leaves aside the facticity of these grounds. They're in a sense, in the sense that they were initially out of reach, they remain out of reach. Right? So what does possibilizing mean? The way I try to think about it is use the Kantian notion as expounded by Korsgaard. So look. You mentioned nature. What is the natural part of our being that's out of reach? Well, you might say it's our inclinations, right? It's our inclinations and drives. They overcome me, they take me over. I don't know what. I'm driven by them, you know. They're just there. I can't get them into my power. And so what does it mean to possibilize them? Well, it means to take them up and make them, as she puts it, following Kant, I can choose to make them my maxim or not. I can choose to act on them or not. In a sense of, in giving in to a drive, I am doing so freely. Even if I'm giving in, and I make it, because we're human beings and free, and because we're existential and not merely factic, I can't just have drives that cause me to do things. They're always possibilized. Even when I'm being driven by them, I'm choosing to be driven by them in that sense. So what does that mean? I tried to render that in terms of the notion of the agathon and the good in Plato. So I'm thinking of this in terms of explaining things in light of what is best. So in a certain kind of way, what I can say is when I possibilize my inclinations, what I'm doing is seeing them as best. Right? In a sense, I've made them my maxim. What makes make them a maxim is to think of them as my reason. This is why I'm doing this. I think it's best. You can say, well, then you have all this conflict, weakness of will, and all of these moral problems of moral psychology, where you seem to know the good, but you can't do it. And I admit that there are all kinds of problems in moral psychology that we have to look at here, but that's the move. Namely, they remain my inclinations, and in a certain sense, I have no power over them. They're going to stay. That drive is going to stay there, but it's my maxim as to whether it's my choice, as it were, whether to make it my reason or not, whether to make it my maxim. And so what that rules out is simply the idea that you can ever explain human beings as being driven causally by their drives or by this factic ground. And you can do the same thing by, if you think of the factic ground or what ultimately grounds us beyond our power as God. Because, I mean, it's a big issue too, but I have to allow God into my life, as it were. I have to make God my maxim, and so I'm even participating there, so to speak, even though clearly I'm not. I would be posited by God in the same way that if you're an atheist or whatever, you'd be posited by nature. So I don't have that in my power, but I can't just be positive because I'm free or transcendent. I turn this whole being positive or being situated into something that I see in light of better or worse, and therefore it becomes a reason.
And so, I mean, Dasein then is driven, this drive to take over the ground, right? It's not going to be, I mean, it's not as though I can then, that I can sort of become God to myself, like
No.
I would just put it there, or nature, that I can sort of change nature.
No.
But, so the point would be that I can choose to follow my inclinations or not.
Yeah.
And then is that sort of converting inclinations into a reason in a way that a purely natural being can't?
Yes.
So that would.
Yes. And notice, I mean, the Heideggerian language is weird. I'm released somehow. I'm released to the ground for taking over. I can't ever get the ground into my power, but I have to take over to be the ground existing. Now, if you really try to unpack what being the ground existing means, existingly refers to the for the sake of and the project, and that I'm glossing here in terms of seeing things in light of the best, well, actually, it's an ability to be. It's a kind of skill, and what is this kind of skill? An ability to exist in a certain way, which the only thing I'm adding here from it being a time that some people don't see, is that if you really want to say what's the difference between a factic ground and possibilizing, you have to have something else, and what the something else is that element of normativity, because that's what everybody denies is not in Heidegger. They deny it's not. The move from factic ground to possibilizing, to explain what that is, he doesn't tell you in being time. He just says possibilizing, whatever. He doesn't even say that much. I had to put that much together. But people don't see that that's the moment at which the long lost, absence of a normative dimension in Heidegger is present. I mean, because if you see what that could only mean, I don't see anything else it could mean but this reference to seeing things in light of better or worse, or the good, or whatever. Now you don't get a morality of natural teleology in Aristotle's sense. You don't get any kind of perfectionism out of it. All the problems of moral philosophy and political philosophy are still there, but at least you have a space within Heidegger's ontology, rather than just say, well, all he does is just talk about choice in a kind of decisionistic way, and anything you choose, that's going to be, valid, and there's no place for creativity. So yes, I mean that's the difference, obviously.
Given your take, can you tell a story about what someone could say from a Heideggerian perspective by way of disapprobation toward Charlie Manson, or a sufficiently resolute Jeff Dahmer, maybe Hannibal Lecter, or George Bush?
or Hitler. Sure. Yeah, I mean,
how does one critique such a person from this perspective?
yeah, well, this is a big question. And I'm tempted to do the Barclay thing. Barclay's answer is always, well, however you can figure it out on your theory, I can figure it out on mine. That is, I'm neutral with respect to, that issue, kind of. For one thing, I mean, I didn't draw this out in the paper, and this is a work in progress, blah, blah, blah. There's a lot of things I haven't thought about, but most of what we need to Jeffrey Dahmer and Manson and Hitler and all those guys, we have just in the one, right? The everyday practices and ordinary morality. Just go along anonymously, and those things are perfectly condemned in terms of all the reasons that we give one another for being good people, and our social practices in all kinds of ways. And it was that way in Nazi Germany too. I mean, that is, Manson and Dahmer are not people who, somehow challenge our moral sense of the world at all, right? So, if you're asking me how I would, approach someone who says, well, what do we say about these people? I would say they're very bad people, and I would, go through probably, basically Kantian line on it, because I'm roughly a Kantian kind of guy. Now, then, where does the question go from there? The question goes, isn't there anything deeper, right? Well, here's the question about other theories. What does your theory have that's deeper, that's plausible? What moral theories are out there that, as it were, gives us more by way of being able to condemn Hitler or Dahmer than we just have in our ordinary moral discourse? So, if somebody challenged, well, your condemnation of Hitler or Dahmer is just parochial because it's part of your cultural milieu, right? It's just part of Western bourgeois, blah, blah, blah. I'm inclined to say, well, that might be enough, but if they press it, what more do we need? And then what kind of moral theory gives us anything more? Aristotle? Well, Aristotle, you've transgressed the, virtues, or, you're not living up to what human flourishing is all about. But then, this isn't going to last very long with all these different views of human flourishing going on out there. So that's not going to provide the really kind of strong justification outside of our ordinary moral discourse. So then, this is where I would tend to say Kant, okay. Pure rational law, he has, broken the categorical imperative, so it's to be condemned. You might say, well, that doesn't go far enough, they're worse than breaking the categorical imperative, but, so there's some kind of evil, deep evil, and that's another question I'll set aside, whether there's something deeper about those guys than simple moral badness and wrongness. Because that would involve a whole other theory. So, if we go to Kant, then we have this notion of reason that seems to be universally valid and rule out, absolutely condemn certain things. I'm tempted by that. I'm tempted by that. Now the question then becomes, your question becomes, can I not avail myself of that if I buy into Heidegger's ontology? And that's where I don't know yet. Most people think I can't, or that is to say, they look at Heidegger's own practice, and they say, Heidegger opted for Hitler. And this proves that he could have been a Mansonite or anything else, because he doesn't have any constraint over his choice. There's no overarching norm that would allow him to when in the situation decision, should I go with Hitler or shouldn't I go with Hitler, you can't look to anything like pure reason that says, absolutely not. No matter if Hitler looks like the only way to save the whole Western world from Germany and Russia, I mean from America and Russia, the pincers of America and Russia, the soulless, you know. Even if he looked like that, as he did to Heidegger, you still can't do it because there's this overarching normative, this is the universal rule of rightness and justice. I'm not sure whether Heidegger's own practice is definitive on what is consistent with his ontology. So I'm not ruling out the idea that if, for instance, I could make this conception of reason as fundamentally a practice of reason-giving work as a Heideggerian position, that I wouldn't be able to appropriate neo-Kantian impulses such as Habermas into that, and therefore be just as indemnified from Hitler or Dahmer as Habermas is, if he is. I'm not sure he is, but that's how I'd go about answering that question, which is a very important one, but I wish I had something better to say about it.
Well, it seems to me that your appeal to Kant would suggest that you would at least like to see somehow such that the appeal to reason transcends mere social consensus.
Something, I mean, I think I do want to say, I mean, I was having this argument with Joe Rouse, who also, he has a very, Foucaultian, kind of immanent, this notion of reason he wants to recast in sort of dialogical and inferentialist terms that doesn't have any ground outside the practices. There's nothing outside these practices that establishes any kind of connection, any normativity. And I resist that. I resist that kind of historicizing, deep pragmatism, you might say. And I don't think Heidegger was into that either. But whether, but where I would go to, do justice both on the one hand to what I think is correct, namely the radical individuation, the radical inescapability of a certain responsibility for a certain ultimate responsibility for normativity on the part of each individual, on one hand, and some kind of normative authority that was transcendent in the traditional sense on the other. I'm just not sure how I can reconcile those two.
Well, just
Sure.
what's this agathon business?
Yes.
Where's that coming?
That's phenomenological as far as I'm concerned. It's simply a phenomenological point that when I'm choosing between acting on my motive or doing something else, acting on my impulse or doing something else, I'm choosing in light of what I take to be the best. That doesn't give me any right to some inference that there is the best out there, some transcendent best or some absolute standard against which I'm measuring this. It's just a point that people choose what they, in light of the best, what they find to be the best. Now, maybe some other philosophical theory can move from that, the trace of the best in our phenomenology, to the ultimate best. That is the ultimate source of all this. But this would, for me, that kind of move, I just can't make it. That's a move from phenomenology to what I call metaphysics. And I'm a Kantian in the sense that metaphysics is not possible. At best, at a practical kind of metaphysics, it's kind of relative. To round all this stuff off, we'll believe in God and immortality, because otherwise it doesn't make sense. But that's not real metaphysics.
But you did make the suggestion of the paradoxical suggestion of choosing inclination, choosing the face of inclination. So the people that you're naming, and I agree on all of them, maybe they all have that inclination and they make that choice in the face of a normative neutrality.
Dahmer and those guys? Absolutely, I think they did. I mean, they acted on inclination in light of what they thought is the best. Now, we can criticize, let's say their inconsistency. That's what I mean by ordinary morality. I mean, there's a lot of resources for saying, look, I mean, Hitler thought this was a great thing to do, but he was just mistaken about all these things, and Dahmer and these other people. That gets us a certain way, but it doesn't get us all the way. Don't you think, I mean, people do, this is a big question, can people really choose evil? This is kind of an old, ancient conundrum, right? I mean, and on this account, they really can't. And in Kant, I think in Kant, this notion of radical evil, he had to appeal to this notion of radical evil, which was a desperate move on his part. It really wasn't, he had to postulate this choice for evil somewhere in our, past, because he couldn't point out anywhere in actual people where that happens. I mean, that is to say, surely Hitler thought he was doing what was the best in some weird way. And if we had a chance to sit down with him, to calm the hour, we could give our reasons why we think he was wrong. We could criticize him, and he might listen. To the extent that he doesn't listen, or is incapable of listening, then he's in the same ballpark as a parrot. You can also say those things, but you can't sit down and talk with a parrot. A parrot might even answer back, train the parrot to answer back, but you're not really carrying on a conversation. So, I'm not saying I would be able to convince Hitler, but at least he's in the ballpark of giving reasons and so on. What does this get us? It just means that if Heidegger's right, then at some level we have to be treating this as though Hitler is seeing things in light of what he takes to be the best, rather than having something called evil sort of causally welling up through him, making him do things. And therefore we can't have a kind of conversation with the force of nature, so to speak. I have a feeling I'm not really answering the question.
I'm just trying to see that as an inclination.
What? Which is an inclination?
What you just said, that ego, that ego.
I see. Okay, yes.
The inclination you were saying in the face of which.
Yes, okay, but in that sense, I would agree with you. I mean, these